Hey there YouTube, I'm Ikitsu, this is the Ikitsu Times. Welcome to my channel, welcome to a little bit of Age of Wonders Planetfall. So we've gotten around to the last of the Vanguard combinations here. This is Vanguard Xenoplague. I saved this one for last because I figured that this was not going to be a very fun combination. And I was right. So anyway, let's get into this. So first of all, in the Society tab, we've got, as always, all of our good Vanguard stuff, but then we've also got the Biomatter Preparation Training. Now, this is actually kind of vital to playing Xenoplague, not just for Vanguard, but sort of all around. And because of that, it's kind of one of those ones that I'm going to say, yeah, absolutely take it. It's actually pretty strong in the context of what it does as well. What this does is it makes it more likely that you gain pustules, which is the free unit that Xenoplague gets, because they can't actually produce the Xenoplague units. The only way you can get them is by propagating the Xenoplague sort of virus, I guess. And this makes it 30% more likely that a unit that you've infected turns into a pustule at the end of the battle, or is used to improve one of your pustules into a destroyer, or a destroyer into a plague lord. So this is actually a really decent increase to the amount that you're going to get of those, but it's not so much that I feel like it's a great mechanic still. I don't necessarily like those sort of random things where if I want to get a bunch of pustules, I have to go into a bunch of battles, because if I find myself needing a whole ton of units, all of a sudden, being in a situation where I then have to get into a bunch of battles to get those units, not really great. Whereas if I'm able to go swinging into a bunch of those battles just for the purpose of getting a bunch of them, and I don't really need the units because I'm already winning a bunch of those battles there, I didn't really need those. It's more of a get more ahead sort of mechanic than it is a functional one otherwise. But this is pretty powerful. You use it in the early game when you're fighting lots of camps and stuff like that to increase your yield and make it so you can get more stacks of pustules in the early game. Pretty good. Next up, we get access to Biomatter Scavenging. There's no purpose to this one whatsoever. Every unit you kill that's biological or cyborg, you get an extra 5 hit points of healing, so it lets you sort of keep your units sustained for longer, but you don't need this. I don't really recommend it. Next up, we get access to the Forced Infection. What this does is it causes all of your own units to be Bioplague infected. If you're throwing out tons of stacks of just really lousy troops there, or you're fighting with your garrisons a lot, or you're using summonable things that can allow this, then you're going to be able to get a lot more Xenoplague units through those sort of mechanics. And because of that, this can be actually fairly useful, especially once you've gotten very, very large armies of expendable units there, which is a trend for me. I do tend to do that in the late game. And what this does is it just makes it so that you can keep your Xenoplague units rolling in the late game, where they're probably also getting killed in larger numbers as well. Do I think this is great? Not really. I do wish that there was simply something that let me build the damn things, but apparently that's not really how this faction works. Next up, you get access to the Organic Mutation Research. This is the only flatly economic bonus that you get as Xenoplague, and it's plus 20% to science. If you've rushed infection experiments for some damn reason, this can be a pretty decent one, and even if you haven't, this is a pretty substantial bonus to the amount of science that you're getting. I don't find that it's super important to get it once you get to this point in the game, but it can be very useful to have that science bonus at this point in the game, so I do think Organic Mutation Research is pretty okay and pretty strong. I'm not using it in this particular case. On this game speed, you just don't need it. You research everything basically instantaneously, but if you're in a normal sort of a game, or you don't have a ton of science or something like that, you can get a big kick out of it. So I think it's okay. So anyway, going on to Military tab, we get access to no pustules. You'll notice that it's not on the tech tree basically. This faction does not get the ability to produce any of their 3 units. Basically, they can only get these units through that infection mechanic that I talked about earlier. So if I wanted to get a pustule, I can't research it, I can't build it. I have to go out to a fight, I have to infect some stuff, and then I have to kill them and hope that the lucky number gods are smiling down upon me to get that unit. As compared to, like, say, the Heritor with their Drained, where if you kill a unit that's been condemned to Drained, you get a Drained. This one is much easier to apply the effect onto a lot of things there, but they're a lot less likely to actually produce the results that you want there. So anyhow, what you've got in this situation is a module tree here that's Almost everything on here can be applied to all of your Vanguard units, but a lot of their bonuses I don't find particularly strong. So we'll go through that sort of first here. So the Xenoplague Parasite, this one just makes it so that you've got some resistances and some extra health. This is actually pretty okay as a defensive mod there. I don't find that this is something that I typically need. This one can only be applied to biological units in this particular case, but I think it's an okay one, especially if you find yourself against a Cynumbra player or something like that, where you just need to have a little bit more resistance. Although, again, this doesn't actually give you the resistance to psionic status effects. What it does give you is that ferocious determination. The reason that that's useful against psionics is because it makes you immune to the Filled with Despair's negative morale effect there and a bunch of other things, as well as giving you sort of the ability to be immune to the mind control effects that Cynumbra has. There's a couple other situations where you might want to have that, but most of the time +2 to immune, +2 to resistance to status effects, it's okay. It's not really something I would typically pick. Next up, you get access to the Plague Pods. Unfortunately, you're going to be spamming a lot of these as the Vanguard, which I don't really like. There's 2 vectors for infection for non-Xenoplague units. If you have a Xenoplague unit, the Destroyer, the Plague Lord, or the Pustule, any of those 3 innately have infestation on their parasitic infestation on their attacks there. Infection, sorry. But for all of your other units, you have to apply module to get that. For range type units, you have to use Plague Pods, which lets you sort of throw these out there, and they will then deal some damage, and they'll cause some stagger, and they'll potentially infect things. I think this is a fairly weak module. It does give you that full sort of hit like a grenade, and it does let you sort of stagger lock units a little bit more effectively. But the reality is 9 times out of 10, if I'm given the choice between throwing a grenade with my infantry or using their standard attack, I get a lot more damage out of their standard attack. It's usually more effective and more efficient for me to be attacking with them. This sort of forces you to use those troopers in situations where you don't want to be throwing a grenade, to throw a grenade. Otherwise, you're just not going to be able to get pustules, you're not going to get destroyers, you're not going to get plague lords. So unfortunately, the plague pods are kind of vital to playing this combination if you want to be playing this combination. Of course, you can just ignore this completely, in which case, why the hell are you playing Xenoplague? You know, that's kind of the problem with that. Now, if I was playing a melee faction, something that had access to that, Xenografted muscles are fantastic. If you're in a situation, for example, where you've got a Kirko Frenzied or something like that, this gives you a decent chunk of extra damage, has a very high infection rate, and is attached to their primary attack. So what you want to be doing with your Kirko Infected or Frenzied is using that melee attack whenever you get a chance to. Yes, their ranged attack is something that can be used as an opening volley and is a pretty decent one under certain circumstances, but you ultimately want to be using your melee attack whenever you can because it's a lot more damage. This means that you're using your damage ability and you're encouraged to continue using your damaged ability after you've taken that upgrade, and you're rewarded with the ability to gain access to more pustules. That doesn't happen with Vanguard. With Vanguard, you're forced to use a suboptimal action instead of your good action with your units there, and throw the Plague Pod instead of getting something more useful done. So that's kind of why I think that this is this is, I think, one of the worst combinations. Most factions have some units that can kind of use melee effectively there. Vanguard is like the faction that is most allergic to melee upgrades. Next up, you get access to the Biospore Purification mod. This one's okay. It lets you sort of clear away some negative status effects, which I always think is situationally pretty good and pretty useful. Plus 30 healing, it's kind of okay. Nothing too terrible about that. It does come alongside the Xena Restoration Beam, which is a pretty powerful heal. But it's pretty expensive for a heal type effect there. I prefer the cheaper ones, personally speaking. Next up, you get Biospore Hyperaggression. This one's actually pretty powerful. It's got a wide radius effect there, and increases damage for a bunch of things with 25% extra damage. For a plus 15 health mod, this is pretty powerful. You only need a couple of them in a composition, but you can just sort of throw it down on 1 or 2 units there, have them support your army by popping the Biospore Hyperaggression when you're about to go in for the attack, and since it's a free action, I find it actually to be pretty powerful. It's one of the better mods that these guys have, and I think that's probably just going to be pretty useful no matter what you're playing as. Lastly, you get access to Parasitic Symbiosis. This gives you a whole bunch of different effects here that are all pretty minor individually, but all in all, they make your unit quite a bit more powerful. Unfortunately, cannot be applied to your higher tier units that can really make use of this, and it is actually just a rehash of the ability that already exists on the Plague Lord, so it's not necessarily like an amazing ability there. Next up, you get access to Spore Proliferation, which brings a target dead unit back to life there. Unfortunately, again, the Plague Lord already has that, so if you're up on your game and you're getting Pustules, Destroyers, and Plague Lords, you don't really need the last two ones here, because a lot of these are support type abilities. There's some non-support stuff in here, but realistically speaking, the most powerful effects of these are their sort of aura type abilities or their support type abilities. You just don't need it if you've got the Plague Lords. So anyway, we run into the sort of problem that, generally speaking, if you're playing as Vanguard, the only mods that you're really looking at getting, you kind of have to waste a mod on Plague Pods, which I think is kind of a lousy mod. Doesn't scale very well, only works against certain types of units. In any event, if you find yourself up against like all mechanical, then it doesn't do anything really. It's a fairly weak module. You can't really replace it though, because if you do, you don't have any infection vectors. If you find yourself in a situation, of course, where your opponent has gone pure mech to counter you, of course, do drop the Plague Pods. It's not going to help you at all. You're not going to get any infection anyway. But if you've got the ability to get parasitic infections off even only half the time or on half the enemy units there, then it's still functionally important for you to be able to do that. The Biospore Purification can be situationally useful. I don't tend to find that Vanguard really uses these sort of negative status effect clears too often, but it can be useful situationally. So you might want to throw that onto something like a Pug, or maybe a Scout or something like that, or even a Bike or something like that. Biospore Hyperaggression, I think that this is actually a really good mod for Vanguard. I think it's going to prove to be a pretty good mod for everybody, but it's not necessarily my favorite. One of the problems I have with this is that it's kind of a mix between offense and defense in that it's plus 15 health, but it gives you plus 25 damage to a whole bunch of units there. If the sort of reason I don't think this is great is simply because a lot of your units could instead have access to something like the Flash module to get that plus 30% damage, as well as a much more powerful secondary effect there. The fact that you can just throw this onto a support type unit, though, is what sort of saves this. You can throw it on like a Pug again or something like that, or a Scout or a Bike or whatever else that you're not going to think is having great action economy or a lot of really powerful abilities, and can sort of just therefore load itself down with support type stuff and use its actions for support instead of having mods that make it more powerful at fighting. This can become quite strong in those sort of situations there. But that's pretty much all you're going to be upgrading your Vanguard troops with. None of them are, in my opinion, as strong as if I was playing another secret technology, though. If I wanted to have like my troopers, my tanks, my other things, these upgrades are ones that work, the ones I mentioned. The problem is, again, if I was playing another secret technology, I could make much, much stronger troopers, or I could make much stronger sort of combinations there. For the Xenoplague units themselves, the Pustule, it's a sort of a low-tier melee unit that's deceptively hard to kill because of their high evasion statistics. It's very easy for a Pustule to get around the battlefield without taking any damage from normal attack types there. There are a few things that sort of bypass their skitter and evasion and small target status, as well as their defensive stance. It is possible to kill them with those sorts of abilities pretty easily, but under normal circumstances, what you do with Pustules is you sort of like run around and have them be annoying and deal a surprisingly high amount of damage in melee combat. And of course, if they're doing those attacks in melee combat, then they're capable of getting infection, which lets you get more pustules, which is pretty great. They evolve into the Destroyer, which is a little bit more durable. It's got a little bit more hardness to it. They've still got a more powerful melee attack. The Acidic Bile Spit is non-repeating, but you can use it under a lot of situations, like if you're being attacked from the air. It's your only real option there. And it's not a fantastic unit, but it does work kind of okay. Now, the thing to note about this unit, the Plague Lord and the Pustule, none of these three units really can use any of the Vanguard modules. Pretty much, you're just looking at throwing on nanite injectors, and if you really wanted to, you could put on the sequential kill system. And the nanite injectors work really well on these guys. They work well on literally everything in this game. But the sequential kill system is not a great module for these guys, so Part of the problem with this combination is that Vanguard doesn't give anything to Plague. Lastly, for the Plague Lord, this is a pretty tough, tanky, powerful unit there. It's got some good options in terms of what kinds of attacks it can use. The only thing it's really lacking by comparison to a lot of other high-tier units is it has no real powerful area of effect options there, by which I mean it doesn't have any area of effect options at all. But it's got a range 9 snipe ability. It's got a pretty strong repeating gun type attack there, and it's got decent melee attack there as well. You can sort of use it at whatever range you think is going to be useful there, and it's going to do okay, but you're stuck modifying it with Xenoplague mods, and the Xenoplague mods do not make this into a super powerful killer, and they don't even necessarily make him into something that is hyper tanky either, so you're looking at a unit that kind of feels like a fish out of water in a lot of situations there. I think there are going to be better factions for using that one than the Vanguard. So anyhow, let's take a look at how I've arranged some of my compositions here. If I can find the damn things, they're all bloody over the map here. So over here we've got one stack here, which has got just a random thing that we picked up. Oops. Yeah, we got like 3 Plague Lords here. Like I said, if you play very aggressively with those grenades and stuff like that, make sure that you're equipping everything with the ability to apply parasitization here, parasitic infection across the board there. You're going to be able to build up a large number of pustules, which are going to turn to a large number of destroyers, which will turn to a large number of Plague Lords. This is just an inevitable sort of outcome of playing Xenoplague, assuming that you actually want to play Xenoplague. Of course, I could have just completely ignored that mechanic, ended up with completely Vanguard heavy units, and continued on with my life. But you know, why I would have picked a secret technology that was not Xenoplague if I really thought that that was more interesting. Here we got another Plague Lord, we got some pustules, and I've also been building walkers. These guys have access to the rail accelerators. In this case, I've given them the kinetic phase modulators and the Biospore Hyperaggression. These guys can't infect things. I'm relying heavily on everything else to get those infections out for me. Over here, we've got access to our regular old trooper. They've got the plague pods, the nanite injectors, and in this case, the flechette ammunition. That's because we were not fighting anything that was mech heavy. In this case, since I'm going for relatively cheap options here, I would have switched over to electrified if I was fighting against something that was a little bit more mech heavy. So that's kind of how we've been running them. Over here we've got more Plague Lords, more pustules, more Plague Lords, more Destroyer, some random little things there. Over here we've got our starting army there. It's got a couple Plague Lords, it's got a couple of these troopers, same sort of type there, an unupgraded pug, and our commander. Basically speaking though, this has been a game which has been largely getting lots of those pustules out there and sort of upgrading them whenever I can. I've got an air stack over here that's got these soldier bees. We've got some more soldier bee stacks over here. These guys are actually upgraded fairly heavily as well in some instances and not in others because I didn't have enough Cosmine stuff like that. But over here we've got a couple with the Xenografted Muscle and the Nana Injectors and the Biospore Hyperaggression. Combination lets these guys actually hit surprisingly hard in melee combat there. Anyhow, let's take a quick look as well. I should probably show you guys what these guys have. Nanite Injectors, the Xenografted Muscles, and the Plague Pods. The reason that they've got Plague Pods is that they will carry over upgrades from their previous forms. So if I had this guy upgraded here, we could upgrade it to this archetype here, and they would have that set of upgrades once they upgrade it into a Plague Lord. It's actually better to upgrade these guys earlier, like when they're pustules, because it means that the upgrade cost is cheaper, since they basically get to keep their sort of upgrades as they sort of go along the path there. So I don't have any upgraded pustules right now just because I have not had enough Cosmite to keep that up. We might have some over here. Yeah, here we go. So these are the ones that we've got here. They've got the Nanite Injectors, Xenografted Muscles, and the Plague Pods. As you can see, their damage statistic is actually surprisingly high. They've got a decent amount of damage to them that mostly just comes from the Xenografted Muscles. It's a pretty powerful upgrade there. Even on a unit that inherently already does infection, I think that's sometimes worthwhile throwing on them. For the Plague Lords, it's the same thing. I would love to get them all modified out of that, but basically it's cheapest to just sort of let them sort of get the mods that they've got there. The ones that we fully upgraded here have the Sprouting Infestation, which is pretty powerful for us, but one of the nice things is that it is actually not too expensive to switch out of this here to that other variety. It's got a slight discount because we've already got one of the mods there, so we get the part of the Cosmite cost refunded and everything. So that's broadly speaking what we've been up to with this particular playthrough. We've got another stack up here that's just going to be basic troopers there. Fairly inexpensive for us to make there. We've got some random stuff loitering around over there. And that is, for the most part, everything that we have running around in this instance. I decided to go walkers instead of tanks in this particular one, although I think that if you wanted to get a high tier unit, that tanks work just as well as the walkers. No particular reason to choose one or over the other. I don't think that the carrier necessarily works super well with this combination, although again, I don't think that this works super well with Vanguard in general, but one of the nice things I like about the walkers is that they sort of synergize okay with other units there. Being able to throw down those upgraded strike missiles from afar gives me at least a little bit of ranged options there to force the enemy closer. But even then, it's not really substantial or anything like that. You can get by in this particular case just by focusing entirely on Plague Lords, basic infantry, and that's about it there. So, in any event though, that is going to be our episode for today. Hope you found this one enjoyable, and of course, as always, hope to see you guys all next time. Next one, we are going to just be doing a quick overview of everything Vanguard without the secret tech.